Look again and don't rush past this moment. What you're seeing isn't confusion, it's a quiet decision. The diner hums beneath tired yellow lights when an elderly woman slips from her wheelchair onto the cold tile. There is no scream, no chaos, only the sound of a body meeting the floor and a silence that follows too quickly. Two police officers stand over her and choose not to move. The camera keeps watching, not capturing words or excuses, but posture, how power holds itself when faced with someone who cannot stand. And in that silent frame rests a truth buried for decades, patient and unyielding, waiting to be seen. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on notifications. Some stories don't cry out for justice. They endure until it arrives. Rain tapped steadily against the diner's windows, smearing the yellow glow of overhead lights across wet asphalt, while the air inside smelled faintly of coffee grease and time that had learned to move slowly. Florence sat near the wall, positioned so her wheelchair would not block the aisle. She was 70 years old, a black woman with soft brown skin worn smooth by decades of quiet endurance. Her silver-gray hair curled naturally around her temples, untamed, but clean, framing a face that carried patience more than age. She wore a faded gray coat, heavy and slightly too large, the kind chosen for warmth rather than appearance. Her hands rested on her lap, thin but steady fingers curled, as if holding something invisible she had learned never to drop. Florence did not fidget. She did not scan the room. She simply existed there, eating slowly each bite, measured, as though she had learned long ago that drawing attention was its own kind of risk. Florence had learned silence the way other people learned language. Not suddenly, not by force, but gradually through repetition. When you spoke and nothing changed, you learned to stop. When you explained and no one listened, you learned that stillness could be mistaken for peace. Sitting in the diner, Florence felt the familiar comfort of being overlooked. It was not loneliness. It was survival. Behind the counter stood Sarah, the waitress on the late shift. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slightly hunched from years of leaning over tables, her auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail that slipped free no matter how tightly she tied it. Her skin was pale, freckled along the arms, and her eyes carried a softness that hadn't yet been trained out of her. Sarah moved gently, especially around Florence, refilling her water without asking, wiping the table slowly so as not to startle her. Sarah didn't know Florence's story. She only knew the look of someone who didn't want trouble and deserved none. The bell above the diner door rang sharply. Two men entered, bringing with them the smell of rain and authority. Their presence shifted the room before either spoke. Andrew Collins walked first. He was a white, middle-aged police officer with a shaved head that reflected the diner lights, a thick neck merging into broad shoulders, shaped by years of control rather than fitness. His dark blue short-sleeved uniform stretched tightly across his chest badge, polished shoulder patches, crisp. His jaw was clenched, as if it had learned to stay that way, his mouth a straight line of irritation. Collins moved like a man who expected space to open for him, and usually it did. Years earlier, a use-of-force investigation had brushed close enough to scorch him without burning. Since then, his patience had grown thin, his dominance sharper, as if restraint were a personal insult. Behind him was David Anderson. Also white, also middle-aged. His black hair was cut short and neat, regulation perfect, his uniform worn with practiced precision, nameplate, centered belt, fully stocked. Where Collins radiated blunt force, Anderson carried tension. His eyes were narrow constantly, measuring his posture rigid with the need to enforce order before it escaped him. He spoke often in commands not because he enjoyed power, but because uncertainty made him angry. People who questioned him reminded him of moments he preferred to forget, moments when control had slipped through his fingers. Their eyes found Florence almost immediately. She felt it before she looked up. That subtle pressure, that familiar tightening in her chest. Florence raised her gaze slowly, meeting Colin's stare for a fraction of a second before lowering it again. She had done nothing wrong, she knew that. But knowledge and safety had never been the same thing. Ma'am, Anderson said, his voice clipped and sharp, already irritated. "You can't be sitting here." Florence blinked once. "I'm eating," she replied quietly. Her voice was soft, but not weak. Colin stepped closer, looming. "You've been here too long," manager called it in. Sarah stiffened behind the counter. "I didn't," she began, then stopped when Collins turned his head slightly toward her. The look was enough. Florence's fingers tightened around the armrest of her wheelchair. She felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not fear, but the old familiar ache of injustice she no longer expected to fix. "I'll be done soon," she said. Anderson exhaled sharply. "Now." What happened next was small, almost nothing. A hand placed where it didn't need to be. A push that could be explained away later. Collins nudged the wheelchair forward, not hard, just enough. Florence's balance was already compromised. The wheels caught unevenly against the tile. Time slowed not dramatically, but cruelly. She felt herself tipping her hands, reaching for the table edge too late. The chair slid. Florence fell sideways, her body meeting the cold diner floor with a dull, hollow sound. Pain bloomed along her hip and shoulder, bright and immediate. But worse than the pain was the silence. Collins and Anderson stood over her. They did not kneel. They did not reach down. Collins crossed his arms. Anderson stepped back half a pace, eyes scanning the room as if the problem were already solved. Florence lay there, staring at the ceiling lights blinking slowly. She did not cry out. She had learned better than that. Above them, all the ceiling camera watched without emotion. It recorded the fall. It recorded the pause. And most of all, it recorded the way two men chose to stand when confronted with someone who could not. The video moved faster than Florence ever had. It leapt from phone to phone, from late-night group chats to morning news tickers, compressed into a few seconds of shaky clarity that invited outrage without context. People saw a black woman in a wheelchair fall. They saw two police officers standing. They argued about intent policy framing. What they did not see was Florence as a person, because the internet rarely waited for that part. Florence survived the fall with a bruised hip, a strained shoulder, and a deeper exhaustion that no scan could show. At the hospital, she answered questions with short nods or single words, her voice thin but steady. She declined pain medication stronger than aspirin. She declined a social worker. She declined to press charges that night. None of this surprised the nurse who took her vitals, a woman who had learned to read a certain look in older patients, the look of someone who had learned not to ask for more than would be given. Sarah visited once after her shift ended. She came in still wearing her diner apron, auburn hair slipping free from its tie freckles, bright against pale skin made pink by worry. She stood awkwardly by the bed, hands clasped, eyes apologetic. Sarah spoke softly, apologizing for things she hadn't done, promising to testify, if needed offering a paper cup of coffee. Florence did not drink. Florence listened, nodded, and thanked her. When Sarah left, Florence felt the room settle back into its familiar quiet, the kind that came when there was no one to advocate on your behalf, and no one expected you to advocate for yourself. Outside the hospital, the story grew louder without her. Commentators speculated about lawsuits, about settlements, about whether the officers' actions violated protocol. Andrew Collins and David Anderson were placed on administrative leave, their names withheld in early reports. Their union issued a statement heavy with phrases like ongoing investigation and regrettable incident. The machine moved as it always did, smooth and impersonal grinding toward a conclusion that often felt predetermined. Florence returned to her small apartment 2 days later. It was a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a building that smelled faintly of old carpet and lemon cleaner. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph on the dresser, a younger Florence standing beside a concrete building with barred windows. Her expression guarded even then. She did not look at the photograph often. She did not need to. The memory had learned how to surface on its own. 40 years earlier, Florence had worked nights as a cleaner at a county detention facility. She had been younger then, stronger still, believing that if you kept your head down and did your job, the world would leave you alone. One night she had heard shouting from a cell block that was supposed to be empty. She had seen a man dragged down a corridor, his face already swollen, his wrists cuffed behind him. She had seen the way officers stood, who turned away, who stayed close, who watched without intervening. The next morning, she was told there had been an accident, a fall, a heart condition. The paperwork was neat. The truth was not. Florence had given a statement, brief, factual. It disappeared into a file that was sealed before it could breathe. No one followed up. No one asked again. Over time, Florence learned that silence did not require courage. It required endurance. She carried that lesson forward, letting it shape her life into something small and survivable. Now, as the video replayed endlessly online, Florence felt the old weight settle in her chest. She did not give interviews. She did not correct the record. When a reporter knocked on her door, she did not answer. Not because she was afraid, but because she did not believe the truth would change its mind just because she spoke. Across town, in a room with no windows, a man watched the video without sound. His name was Daniel Hargreave, though most people had once called him Dan. He was in his early 60s, tall but stooped with gray hair that refused to obey a comb and a beard trimmed short out of habit rather than vanity. His eyes were sharp, tired, and methodical. Daniel had been an internal affairs investigator for most of his career, known for his precision and for the way he kept personal feelings locked behind a professional calm. He had retired early after a case that never quite closed, leaving behind a reputation for being thorough and inconvenient. Daniel did not watch Florence fall. He rewound and paused on the seconds before it happened. He studied Andrew Collins' stance, the way his weight shifted forward. His shoulders squared, as if bracing for resistance that never came. He studied David Anderson's position, half a step back, angled ready to support without leading. Daniel recognized the posture immediately. It was not surprise. It was familiarity. He leaned back in his chair, the old one that creaked under him, and rubbed his eyes. 40 years ago, he had reviewed a case involving a death in custody labeled an accident. The names had been different then, but the behavior was the same distance, the same silence. The same understanding among men who believed the system would carry them if they stood just right. The official copy of the diner's CCTV footage vanished from the department server within 48 hours, logged as a routine retention error. Daniel noticed. He noticed because he had already made a habit of noticing what disappeared. A copy of the video surfaced elsewhere, the same night, stripped of metadata, floating through channels that did not belong to any one authority. Daniel did not smile. He simply noted the timing. Florence spent her evenings sitting by the window watching headlights pass her hands folded neatly in her lap. She spoke less than before, conserving words as if they were a limited resource. When the phone rang, she let it go to voicemail. She had lived long enough to know that attention was not the same as justice. What Florence did not know was that the story had begun to move without her voice carried not by outrage, but by patterns. And patterns once seen were difficult to unsee. Daniel Hargreaves sat alone in the dark, the only light coming from the paused frame of a surveillance video reflected faintly in his tired eyes. The room had no windows by design. He had chosen it that way years ago, back when he still pretended retirement was a clean break instead of a slow exile. The walls were bare concrete, the kind that absorbed sound and held secrets well. Daniel was in his early 60s, tall once but now slightly bent at the shoulders, as if time had learned where to rest its weight on him. His hair was gray and uneven, cut by his own hand with no patience for symmetry. A short beard lined his jaw, more habit than style. His face was sharp angular, defined by a nose that had been broken once during a raid he never talked about. People used to say Daniel looked severe. In truth, he was simply precise. He pressed play, pause, rewind, again. He did not watch Florence fall. He watched Andrew Collins' feet. Collins' stance was wide toes angled outward just enough to anchor his weight forward, not defensive, not startled. It was the posture of a man prepared to dominate space, a stance Daniel had seen too many times in too many reports that ended with the same words, "No wrongdoing found." Collins' shoulders were squared, his arms loose ready. He had been expecting resistance, or worse, he had been hoping for it. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. David Anderson stood half a step back, slightly offset to Collins' right. His body was turned at an angle weight, balanced eyes scanning. Not intervening, but not leaving. Support position. Backup posture. The kind taught quietly, never written down. Daniel had seen that stance 40 years ago in a grainy hallway recording that had disappeared a week after he requested the original. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered the file number. He always remembered the numbers. The death had been ruled accidental. Inmate collapse. Pre-existing condition. Officers cleared. Witness unreliable. The witness had been a cleaner, a black woman working nights. She had described the same thing Daniel saw now, not blows, not words, but positions. Who stood where? Who looked away? Who did nothing? At the time, Daniel had pushed. Too hard, according to his supervisors. He had been warned that some battles were unwinnable. When he didn't stop, he was reassigned. When he continued, he was offered early retirement with full benefits and a quiet understanding leave the past where it is. Daniel opened his eyes and stared at the frozen image. The past had not stayed put. He reached for the keyboard and pulled up archived payroll records, his fingers moving slowly but deliberately. Years of habit had carved efficiency into him. Names cross-referenced with overtime logs. Commendations tied to incidents that never made the news. Transfers timed suspiciously close to internal complaints. Andrew Collins' record was clean in the way only a curated one could be. David Anderson's, too. Promotions without competition. Bonuses justified by exemplary conduct. Daniel exhaled through his nose. Patterns were louder than confessions. The official CCTV file deletion caught his attention next. Logged as a server error. Routine maintenance. Daniel almost smiled at the familiarity of it. He checked secondary storage nodes. Empty. Then tertiary. Empty again. Someone had been thorough. Too thorough. Because while the department copy was gone, versions of the video had begun to surface in places no one department could fully erase. A compressed file appeared briefly on an overseas mirror site before vanishing. Another version showed up embedded in an anonymous tip email sent to 3 journalists who rarely shared sources. A third appeared attached to a labor audit request, disguised as a corrupted document. Daniel leaned back in his chair. This wasn't chaos. It was intention. He wondered who else was watching. He wondered if Florence knew that her fall had become something larger than outrage. He doubted it. From what little he had gathered, Florence spoke rarely now. Witnesses who had been ignored long enough learned that words were a currency often devalued. Silence, on the other hand, endured. Daniel stood and stretched joints popping softly. He crossed the room to a filing cabinet pushed into the corner, its metal sides scratched and dented from years of use. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a folder so old the label had faded to near invisibility. Inside were copies, unofficial personal, of cases he had never been allowed to finish. He flipped until he found the one he was looking for, the cleaner's statement. Florence. Daniel had not known her name then, only her job title, only the note scribbled in the margin: witness credible testimony inconvenient. He closed the folder carefully. Daniel did not consider himself a hero. He had learned long ago that heroism required belief in outcomes, and he no longer had that luxury. What he did have was memory, and memory, when paired with patience, was dangerous. He returned to the screen and let the video play one last time, watching Collins shift his weight forward, watching Anderson hold position, watching Florence disappear briefly from frame as gravity did its quiet work. Daniel reached up and turned the sound on for the first time. There was very little to hear. That too mattered. Somewhere across the city, Florence sat in her apartment, hands folded, eyes on nothing in particular. She did not know that a man she had never met was reopening doors sealed decades ago. She did not know that her silence had become a reference point, not a weakness. Daniel shut down the monitor. The room went dark again. And in that darkness, the past finally began to move. The official CCTV file vanished from the department server at 2:17 a.m., logged as a routine system, purge a line of text so bland it almost felt comforting. Daniel Hargreave noticed the deletion before the night was over. He noticed it because systems rarely erase themselves with such clean timing, and because people who feared images often trusted paperwork to finish the job. Daniel had learned long ago that truth was not usually destroyed. It was redirected. He sat back in his chair, the dark room humming faintly with old electronics, and did not rush. Panic was for people who believed exposure came all at once. Daniel knew better. Exposure came in layers. The first copy appeared where no one could officially acknowledge it. Not on social media, not on a news site. It surfaced as a corrupted attachment buried inside a routine payroll audit request sent to the city's finance department. No video player, no thumbnail, just numbers and timestamps wrapped around a data file that did not belong. Daniel smiled without warmth. He shifted his focus away from images entirely. Andrew Collins' payroll history loaded slowly, row by row. Collins had always presented himself as uncomplicated, straightforward, blunt a man who believed rules were weapons rather than safeguards. On paper, his career looked admirable. Consistent raises, commendations tied to high-risk encounters, overtime logged generously during years when the department claimed budget constraints. Daniel highlighted the entries and overlaid them against a separate timeline. The pattern emerged immediately. Every significant pay increase coincided with a case that had been quietly closed. Every bonus followed an internal complaint that never reached review. Collins had been rewarded not for arrests, but for endings, for making problems disappear. David Anderson's file told a quieter story, but no less revealing. Anderson had never been the visible enforcer. He was careful, methodical, the kind of man who followed procedures publicly and bent them privately. His promotions came faster than his seniority justified. His performance reviews praised his ability to maintain control in volatile situations. Daniel translated that phrase easily. Anderson knew when to stand half a step back and let someone else do the visible damage. Daniel pulled archived budget reports from 4 decades earlier. The numbers were less polished, then easier to read. A line item marked discretionary disbursements appeared repeatedly in connection with the detention facility Florence had once cleaned. The amounts were small, forgettable, perfect for hiding violence behind accounting language. Daniel compared those figures to the modern payroll adjustments for Collins and Anderson. The echoes were unmistakable. Truth, Daniel thought, was not loud. It was consistent. The copies of the CCTV footage continued to surface, but never in obvious places. One appeared embedded in a union expense spreadsheet sent accidentally to the wrong email list. Another was discovered inside a compressed archive attached to a property tax reassessment appeal. Each appearance lacked sound. Each focused not on Florence's fall, but on the seconds before it. On posture, distance, stillness. Someone understood what mattered. Daniel did not ask who. He suspected the answer would complicate things unnecessarily. Florence, meanwhile, remained invisible by choice. She moved through her days slowly, deliberately. Her apartment had grown quieter since the incident, as if sound itself had learned to keep its distance. She spoke only when required, her voice softer than before, but never unsteady. When a public defender left a message offering assistance, Florence did not return the call. When a community organizer knocked, she thanked them politely and closed the door. Florence had learned something the world often forgot. Attention did not equal protection. She spent her afternoons near the window, hands folded, watching the city pass without her. At night, she slept lightly, dreams shallow and fleeting. She did not think about the past often, but she felt it pressing closer now, like weather changing before the clouds arrived. Back in the dark room, Daniel compiled his findings into something that looked boring enough to survive scrutiny. He avoided dramatic language. He avoided conclusions. He let the numbers speak. A payroll discrepancy here. A bonus without justification there. A promotion approved during an active investigation. Each data point alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a map. Daniel sent the file anonymously to 3 places: an oversight committee known for moving slowly, a civil auditor with a reputation for stubbornness, and an investigative journalist whose career had stalled after publishing a story too accurate for comfort. He did not include the video. He did not need to. He understood something Collins and Anderson never had. Images outraged people. Data trapped them. Andrew Collins felt the shift before he could name it. He noticed it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the delayed response from the union rep, who usually answered on the first ring. Collins was not introspective by nature, but he recognized pressure when it leaned against his chest. He told himself it was temporary, that the system had always protected him before. David Anderson felt it too, though differently. He began double-checking his email, deleting messages he didn't remember sending, waking at night with the sense that something had been misfiled. Anderson had always believed that if he followed procedures closely enough, the details would never turn on him. He did not yet understand that details were patient. Neither man knew Florence's name. Neither understood that her silence had become irrelevant. Daniel shut down his computer and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet he had chosen. He did not feel satisfaction, only resolve. He had spent his career watching truth drown under testimony. This time testimony was unnecessary. The truth had found a better language, and it was speaking in numbers. The hearing room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a neutral place designed to make emotion feel inappropriate. Florence was brought in last, her wheelchair rolling softly across the polished floor. She looked thinner than she had weeks earlier, her gray coat hanging looser on her shoulders, the silver curls at her temples flattened neatly as if someone had helped her prepare. Her face was calm in a way that did not invite sympathy. It suggested distance. Florence did not scan the room. She did not search for familiar faces. She had learned long ago that looking for allies could make disappointment louder. Andrew Collins and David Anderson stood at the opposite end of the room, separated by a few feet that felt wider than it was. Collins wore a dark suit instead of his uniform, the fabric straining slightly across his broad shoulders. His shaved head reflected the ceiling lights, emphasizing the tightness in his jaw, the way his mouth seemed permanently braced. Collins had always believed authority lived in posture. He stood square feet planted, chin lifted, as if daring the room to push back. David Anderson stood beside him, also, in a suit tailored precisely, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression carefully neutral. Anderson had practiced looking composed his entire career. He kept his hands folded loosely in front of him, weight-balanced, eyes forward. Where Collins projected force, Anderson projected control. He believed discipline could substitute for innocence if applied correctly. At the long table sat members of the oversight panel. One of them, Margaret Liu, presided at the center. She was a woman in her late 50s, petite, with straight black hair cut sharply at the jawline, and eyes that missed very little. Margaret had built her reputation quietly through cases others avoided. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her questions tended to land where evasions failed. Daniel Hargreaves sat near the back, unannounced, unnoticed by most. He had chosen a seat against the wall, hands folded posture, relaxed. His gray beard was trimmed short, his worn jacket plain. Daniel had no official role here. He did not intend to speak. He had learned that influence did not require visibility. The proceedings began with procedural language, careful and bloodless. Findings were summarized. Financial inconsistencies outlined. The absence of the original CCTV file noted without drama. The room listened politely. Collins shifted his weight once subtly, as if resisting the urge to correct the record. Anderson remained still. When Florence was asked if she wished to speak, the room leaned forward without realizing it. Florence adjusted her hands on her lap. Her fingers were thinner now, veins more pronounced but steady. She did not look at Collins or Anderson. She did not look at the panel. She looked at the blank wall behind them, as if seeing something far older than the room itself. "I don't want to testify," she said quietly. There was a pause. Margaret Liu nodded once, accepting the statement without challenge. Florence continued, "I just want to see the video again." No sound. A murmur rippled through the room, quickly silenced. The screen behind the panel flickered to life. The footage played without audio, grainy, but clear enough. Florence did not watch herself fall. She watched the seconds before it. Her gaze was intent, focused not on herself, but on the two men standing over her in the frame. Andrew Collins saw it too. He felt something tighten behind his ribs as the image froze momentarily. He recognized his own stance, remembered choosing it without thinking. A habit, a reflex. Something learned long before policy manuals mattered. David Anderson felt the scrutiny differently. He noticed the angle of his shoulders, the distance he had maintained, the way he had not stepped forward. He had believed that neutrality would protect him. He was beginning to understand it had documented him instead. Florence lifted her eyes from the screen and looked directly at the panel for the first time. "That's all," she said. Margaret Liu leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. She did not ask Florence to elaborate. She did not need to. The room had seen what it needed to see. The panel recessed briefly. When they returned, the air felt heavier, as if something had settled into place. Margaret spoke clearly, her voice level. "This panel finds that officers Andrew Collins and David Anderson engaged in conduct unbecoming of their duties, demonstrated a failure to render aid, and maintained postures consistent with prior documented patterns of misconduct." Collins opened his mouth, then closed it. The words he had relied on his entire career procedure, intent, split-second judgment, felt suddenly inadequate. Anderson's jaw tightened. He stared straight ahead as if posture alone could still save him. The determination Margaret continued is not based on verbal testimony. It is based on observable conduct. Florence lowered her gaze again, hands folding neatly. She did not react. She had not come for vindication. The verdict was delivered without flourish. Termination, decertification, referral for further review. The consequences unfolded like paperwork, dull and final. As the room began to empty, Daniel remained seated. He watched Collins leave, first shoulders rigid, his confidence collapsing inward rather than outward. Anderson followed more slowly, his composure intact but hollow, a man still standing correctly even as the ground shifted beneath him. Florence waited until the room was nearly empty before turning her wheelchair slightly toward the door. Sarah stood there, hesitant, her auburn hair pulled back, her freckled hands clasped nervously. She offered a small, uncertain smile. Florence nodded to her once. It was enough. Outside, the afternoon light was pale and steady. Florence breathed it in carefully. She did not feel triumphant. She felt complete. She had not spoken much. She had not accused. She had simply asked for the truth to be shown without noise. And for the first time in a very long while, silence had carried weight. Florence never asked for justice to arrive like a storm. She waited for it the way faith waits quietly, patiently believing that truth does not disappear just because it is ignored. Some miracles don't come with thunder or angels in the sky. Some come as endurance. Some come as silence that refuses to break. And some come when the world finally learns to see what God has been watching all along. In everyday life, we may never stand in a courtroom. We may never face cameras or headlines. But we all have moments when we feel small, unseen, or powerless moments when standing up feels impossible. This story is a reminder God does not measure strength the way the world does. Sometimes the greatest power is simply staying upright in spirit when your body cannot stand. Sometimes the miracle is that truth waits until the right moment to rise. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters. And if you believe even a little that light still finds its way through darkness, please subscribe and stay with us for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and give you strength in the quiet battles no one else sees. May He watch over your family, your home, and your heart. And may you never forget, no act of kindness, no moment of dignity, and no silent prayer ever goes unnoticed. Amen.